mentality, that's potentially powerful. And we are trying to negotiate a deal on clean energy tax credits, $550 billion to invest in new clean energy solutions, commercializable as well as basic research, which would mark the largest government investment in climate change action in history from any entity. This is important not just for the United States' own obligations to meet our Paris Accord agreements to get to a 1.7 degree increase, no more, by 2050, but also for our ability to have moral suasion with our allies and indeed our adversaries as we get them to meet their Paris Accord agreements, because the United States is only going to account for about 15% of all future fossil fuel emissions. So our role in helping curb and mitigate climate change is frankly more about our ability to persuade our allies and our adversaries than it is even about our own domestic action. All that being said, there's a potential deal to be struck, maybe not on this initial $550 billion package, but in the near term on expanding subsidies for clean energy to get to clean energy independence, which is an objective that both parties share, as well as making it easier to export liquid natural gas, which is a huge issue for Republicans. I see a path there, maybe not this year, but in the near future. And then the final one is the Electoral Count Act reform. This is wonky, not very glamorous, doesn't make the headlines. I can't stress enough how important this is. What we saw on January 6, 2021 with the insurrection was the violent attempt to use a loophole in our tabulation process for electoral college slates. As many of our listeners may know, we don't have a national election system in the United States. We've got 50 state election systems, and they send literally by post office their slate of electors to Congress. We open them up, we read them, we tabulate them, and we formally certify them. And that's a ministerial process, totally a formality, except that it doesn't quite explicitly say that in the relevant law. And so Donald Trump tried to abuse that and tried to have alternative slates of electors be tabulated, but Vice President Mike Pence refused. But we understand now where our weakness is in our federal election system, and the Electoral Count Act reform, which has bipartisan support, would close that loophole. To be clear, by no means does that safeguard our election system from trying to get it stolen in 24. Our states are still where the process actually happens, and state election systems are unfortunately vulnerable to being politicized. But we can do our part in Congress to try to close the federal gap.
All right. So I had a question about, so recently, like across the country and all the states, we're seeing the Democratic primaries. There's really been a lot of internal conflicts between the more moderate establishment wing and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So my question was, how are you seeing these types of conflicts in Washington, and how do you think these conflicts can be addressed?
Well, I would push back on the premise that the moderates are the establishment, the progressives are somehow the insurgents. I think if you look at the state of play in Washington and the primary system, that's oftentimes doesn't actually line up. There's nobody who's more associated with establishment Democratic politics than Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House and long a fixture in Washington, D.C. You look at her voting record, she's one of the most progressive politicians in U.S. history, and she is establishment. At the same time, we see people who ran long shot campaigns and are oftentimes at odds with the party. Stephanie Murphy in Florida, who's a blue dog, who's actually a centrist, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, and others. And they are oftentimes publicly and privately disagreeing with leadership, with the establishment, but they're doing it from the center, not from the left. So I wouldn't totally equate establishment with moderate and progressive with insurgent. I think it's much more complex than that. And indeed, sometimes, if not often, the opposite of that. The most important thing we can do for our country, period, when it comes towards these types of internecine conflicts is fix the primary system. We've got a system right now where in most congressional districts throughout the country, the primary determines the winner. You're just like whoever the Republican or Democratic nominee is, it's a 60-40, 65-35 seat. You know who's going to win. You know, something like 400 out of 435 seats in Congress are that way now because of gerrymandering and because of the primary system. And we need to take on that is such an unhealthy dynamic, because then you get politicians speaking only to their partisan 15th percentile voter, not to their median 50th percentile voter. So we've got to end partisan gerrymandering, and we know how to do that. We saw it happen in New York State. We've seen it happen in New Jersey. We see it happen in California. The political parties hate it, including Democrats, but it's the right thing to do for voters. And I will say that to any Democratic politician who complains about it. It's the right thing to do for voters. Voters choose their politicians, not the other way around. And number two, we got to do what California does, which is the top two advance out of a preliminary, not where you have one D and one R, regardless of the respective weight of the parties. And just so people can visualize that, that's what Boston does when it elects its mayor, for example. Some of you may remember the Boston mayoral race last year. That was two Democrats running for mayor in the final, right? Michelle Wu and Anissa Essabi-George. It wasn't like they were running for the Democratic nomination for mayor, and then there was a Republican nominee for mayor who everyone knew wasn't going to win because it's Boston. And all of a sudden, then the primary becomes the real election, and turnout's lower, and it skews in a disproportionate way to not represent the actual Boston electorate. So we need to take that system and apply it to our primaries nationally. Again, California's done it. It works. I'd love to see New York, Massachusetts, Florida, other big states, Texas, do that as well.
And how is your perception of the way that our Congress works, or the way that the electoral system works? How has that changed since becoming a congressman?
Probably in a few different ways. I'll weigh in here on money in politics for a second, which is always a very sensitive subject, and I think one that's very poorly understood, oftentimes by journalists and politicians as well. I think people get a sense that the way that money works in Washington is like there's all these fat cat corporate donors sitting in a room, and they kind of like decide a policy, and then they throw tons of money at politicians, and it happens. And like, I really can't stress enough how not true that is. Like, that's just not the way that corporate PAC money works. It's highly limited. It's quite transparent. Especially for Senate races, which are now tens of millions of dollars of affairs. Corporate PAC money just is not very much of that, really. It doesn't really weigh too much. And actually, corporate PAC money tends to be moderating rather than polarizing influence. Corporations tend to want kind of down the middle politicians. What it's made me appreciate is actually the most polarizing influence of money in politics comes from these small dollar donor email lists on the left and the right. I'm sure many of you get these emails, right? It's like, you know, all capital font, come help, you know, Nancy Pelosi. She's been locked in a closet in the Capitol. Give $3 right now and you can release her. 17 exclamation points. And you look at this and you're like, who would ever give money to this? This is borderline a scam. And the short answer is a lot of people do. A lot of people give money to those things. The Trump operation has turned that into a legitimate's the wrong word, an illegitimate, actual, I think, criminal operation when they are actually scamming, especially senior citizens, with recurring monthly payments. But to be blunt, the far left does it too, with hyperbolic, overheated rhetoric. Every issue, give us money now. And these email firms rack up a ton of fees and consulting services. And their goal is not to get to solutions. Their goal is to drive up the temperature and to get people mad at each other. Because when people are mad, they give money.
All right. I have a question. Do you ever feel that there's a conflict when choosing what like causes or legislation to fight for? The needs of one community might not be the same of another community.
I could see that happening. I will say that it has not happened in these last 2 years, but it's a reasonable scenario to imagine. I'm trying to think of how it would most likely come out. You know, in general, the district I represent is such a fun and rewarding district to represent, partly because it's socioeconomically and geographically diverse. It has rural, urban, and suburban populations. It's got parts of the district near Boston that went, I mean, close to 80-20 for Biden over Trump, and then parts of the district that went 60-40 for Trump over Biden in 2020. And you get a real different flavor as you interact with them. So there's definitely differences in tone and prioritization, I would say, but no conflicts in actual votes or issues. I think you know, I think to the infrastructure bill, for example, That's been just a huge win for the district and for Massachusetts more broadly.
So on that note, what do you think are the maybe three biggest challenges facing the 4th district?
Overall, I would say housing is probably number one. Housing costs are astronomical. They're going up. We're seeing rising interest rates, which are going to make it less affordable to get a mortgage. And I don't think are going to cool off the market as much as some economists predict it will, especially in some of the near-in suburbs of Boston, which just remain in incredible demand. So both ownership and rental costs of housing they're eating 40, 50, 60% of people's disposable income. And I think the governor would agree with this. It's probably the single biggest liability for Massachusetts in terms of our economic development and our ability to address income and wealth disparity. To be blunt, there's only a few tools that the federal government has to address housing, because the biggest impediment to housing is local and state regulations on new construction. I was a city councilor for 5 years and served on the land use committee in Newton. I saw entitlement process for new construction. Until my last political breath, I will say the best way to address housing inaffordability is to build more housing, build more of it near transit stops, build more multi-family housing, in particular, those 2 to 4 unit dwellings that are really missing in many of our cities where it's either single family or very large mixed use. Make it easier to build accessory dwelling units. We have just got to build more housing in this Commonwealth.
Yeah. So I had a question. In your opinion, what is one piece of legislation that you've helped pass in Washington that you think will really convince young voters to vote for you in November?
Pass the Senate as well?
Yes, that's like a law now.
That's a little tougher because the Senate doesn't pass anything. And there's a lot that we did in the House that I'm proud of that didn't make it through the Senate. Young voters in particular. I think I'll give the two kind of highlighted ones. The infrastructure bill that we passed in the fall really never got the coverage and attention that I think it deserves. For the lifetime of everybody listening on this call, literally for the lifetime, politicians in Washington have been talking about infrastructure, and it feels like the easiest thing that you can do. Fix roads and bridges, ensure clean water, upgrade the electrical grid, invest in clean energy and energy independence. This is like apple pie. How could you not do this in Washington, D.C.? Well, they couldn't. Democratic and Republican administrations failed to do so. And this administration and this Congress did. And it was done in a way that demonstrates that Washington can still work. It was people on both sides of the aisle had thoughtful disagreements, came to a place where everyone could feel good about it. And this is going to meaningfully improve standards of living for this generation in 10 to 15 years as we see the fruits of better airports, better seaports, better trains, better roads, and better water. And then the second is this package that we just approved for Ukraine. We just passed a $40 billion package to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. And sometimes numbers in Washington can lose their luster because the numbers are so big and they get thrown around so often. $40 billion is, when added on to the additional previous aid that we passed for Ukraine, it's like a third almost of Ukraine's yearly GDP. I mean, we are basically supporting an industrialized economy as it fights against an unprovoked, unjust war. That's military aid, in addition to tactical and intelligence support. That's economic aid, particularly agriculture, and it's humanitarian aid for internal and external refugees. This is a investment in the future of the Pax Americana and the rules-based international order. And the youth, I think, should most appreciate that. One of the glories of our post-war system since World War II is that in general, in much of the world, might does not make right. And we've got globalized commerce, trade, and cultural and diplomatic exchange. It's been uneven, it's been imperfect, but it's certainly been better than the alternative and what came before. And Russia is directly threatening that. it's not a world that I want my kids to grow up in. Is a world where might makes right, and where the Vladimir Putins of the world can revoke a people's right to self-determination. And this aid that we're giving to Ukraine is about the world that we want the next generation to get to grow up in. Let me just say, I wish I could say the clean energy tax credits, because I know that young people especially are so energized by climate change, as am I, which is why I've co-sponsored the Green New Deal and its corresponding legislation. Unfortunately, it hasn't passed the Senate. And I want to assure our listeners that it is an absolute focus of mine to do my utmost to persuade our Senate colleagues to get it across the finish line, because it's a no-fail mission.
Are there any other pieces of legislation that you've helped pass in the House, but have not passed the Senate that you really hope do get passed?
So one area that I've worked very hard on in particular, and it's a little bit more complicated than just purely passing the House, although we have gotten much of that done, is vaccine distribution overseas. The United States, we developed the 3 vaccines that are really saving the world right now. And we've got enough of them to give to everybody in the world who needs them, to help people get up to help countries, I should say, get up to the 70% vaccination rate that's the Biden administration's goal. And yet we've lacked the political will to do so. We made a grievous error with the American Rescue Plan in January and February of 2021 in not allocating more of that money towards global aid. It was a missed opportunity. And I've tried very hard through resolutions around a Marshall Plan for global vaccines, through pressuring the administration, through co-chairing the Global Vaccination Caucus, to make clear the case for investments in vaccine distribution to complement our success in vaccine production. We've got to invest in last mile solutions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to build a sustainable public health workforce, which can empower economically so many of those citizens, and also just to get the shots in arms so that new variants don't emerge, and so that the United States has built a positive relationship with these nations, which are so demographically powerful, if not yet economically powerful, in the face of Chinese efforts to basically create vassalage states with their infrastructure lending.
And so what is the relationship like between the House and the Senate? Do members of Congress have regular talks with senators? What is that like?
No, senators tend to think they're too cool for us in the House. Especially as a freshman member of the House, it can take a little while to get meetings with senators. I have, but there is a little bit of an arm's length distance. Every senator walks around and sort of thinks they're like a Roman proconsul. And, to be blunt, if I were a senator, I probably wouldn't hang out with the House too much either, because they're the ones who are the bottleneck for so much legislation, right? Like every single senator has the power to be a Joe Manchin if they wanted to be. I mean, only Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema have, but any given senator could do it if they wanted to. And that's probably more fun than talking to Jake Auchincloss. So I have limited interactions, but mostly on global vaccinations, like I said, and then with the Massachusetts senators, with Ed Markey and Senator Warren, very, very strong relationship as we work on issues like offshore wind or childcare or things that are very important to the Commonwealth.
Has there been any senators that you've actually been able to become friends with?
Friends might be a strong word.
Friendly communications with.
Nothing like, no one that I'm like texting back and forth, hanging out with. On different issues, we'll engage with different senators. So again, offshore wind with Ed Markey, with drug pricing issues, I was engaged with a couple different senators. But no, I'm not getting beers after work with any of them.
Does being a veteran make it any easier or to form different relationships with members of Congress?
Yes, it does. It's not a panacea. So at a certain point, you still got to talk about policy. I don't care how long you've worn the uniform. Like, you're not going to change your vote because someone's a veteran, but it does makes it easier to start the conversation and to have a baseline of trust. And veterans in Congress have had an outsized role. Folks forget this because so much has happened since then, but it was national security Democrats, ones who had backgrounds in intelligence or military, who really convinced Speaker Pelosi that we had to bring impeachment charges against Donald Trump the first time around when he was blackmailing the Ukrainian president to try to get dirt on Hunter Biden. Little did we know, I say we, the kind of royal we in Washington, people didn't realize just how dangerous that was for our national security. Well, look at what's happened with Ukraine and Russia. I mean, having the US president not have the US interests first and foremost, but rather have political interests first and foremost when dealing with Ukraine is clearly a national security issue. And it was national security Democrats who brought that really to the fore. And there is a significant need for that kind of thinking in Washington, because Republicans who like to claim that they're the party of foreign policy and national security have totally abdicated that role. I mean, half of them are isolationists who say, I don't care what happens in Ukraine, just listen to Tucker Carlson or JD Vance in Ohio. And the other half are still stuck in this kind of George W. Bush militaristic mindset of you kind of have two tools. You either don't engage or you invade. And so it's important for Democrats to have a different approach that can still convince voters that we're taking national security very seriously, because we are.
How do you think Democrats can use national security as a pro when it comes to the upcoming elections?
So it's tough because really at no election since 2004 have voters voted on national security or foreign policy issues. The Iraq War midterms in presidential in 2004 was really the last time that issue was a top three issue. I don't expect it's going to be a top three issue in 2022. I wish it were, because Joe Biden's doing a good job on Ukraine, and I think he should be seeing higher favorables because of his handling in Ukraine than he is. But I don't think we are going to see that. I think a lot of these races are going to be coming down to inflation anxiety, immigration anxiety, especially on the right. What I will say, though, is that voters are less partisan about foreign policy than they are about domestic policy, meaning that they have a slightly more open mind about job performance when it comes to foreign policy issues than they do on domestic policy. They're less tribal in their evaluation on both sides. And they reward competence. One of Trump's biggest liabilities always was his foreign policy trips, because he was so incompetent and so embarrassing to the United States that it did undermine the Republican Party and its brand and his own standing at home. I don't think it did so enough or persistently enough, but it did. And so I do think that contrasting the competence that Joe Biden has displayed in holding together NATO in the face of this aggression versus what it would have been like had Trump been in power and he's sitting there telling Vladimir Zelensky, get me some laptop or whatever in exchange for javelins. I think that matters. I think that will resonate with at least some section of voters.
Just switching over to a little bit of a different issue, we have an audience question. So what is your stance on Roe versus Wade, and then what can be done within the Congress about the possible overturning of Roe?
This decision is egregious. Access to reproductive health care is a fundamental right. And regardless of what the final ruling is, we know that the Supreme Court no longer can be trusted to uphold Roe. And so it needs to be codified by Congress. We in the House did that, the Women's Health Protection Act, which with some slight modifications basically just takes Roe and makes it the law of the land nationally. It's the right thing to do. And we finally had a pro-choice majority in Congress to do it. Again, the Senate, the filibuster didn't pass, won't pass. And so when the people's representatives don't reflect the will of the people, and they don't here, let's be very clear, Americans by a wide majority do not support overturning Roe. They do not. When the people's representatives don't reflect the people's values and priorities, you take it to the ballot box. And in Senate elections in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia, North Carolina, we need to be putting this on the ballot and saying, when you vote for a Republican senator, you're voting for someone who would probably vote to not just not make it legal nationally, but to make it illegal nationally, to proactively say they do not want any state, even Massachusetts, which has codified it at the state level, to be allowed to provide safe, legal, and accessible abortions. Democrats can win on that message because American voters, unlike the Supreme Court, have a quite a clear and grounded sense of how they think abortion plays into women's reproductive health, which is that it's a integral part of it. In the meantime, in the short term, as we wage this political fight, we're going to need to be able to support women in reproductive health care deserts in the 24 to 26 states that have trigger laws that are likely to rescind or restrict abortion when the Supreme Court overturns it. That means mail order medication, which can be very effective, especially for early term abortions, as well as access to cross-state services, being able to, in states like Massachusetts, help women coming across state lines get subsidized care, including subsidizing their transportation. And I'm proud to say that state legislators in Massachusetts approved $2 million to make the Commonwealth a safe haven state for that kind of care. So we're going to need to have a couple of different elements of sort of near-term triaging and support for women in states like Missouri and Mississippi.
So in order to defend like the Democratic Party's position on these issues with like codifying Roe v. Wade and like Biden's infrastructure bill, do you think it is worth getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate in order to pass Biden's agenda?
Yeah, I think we should get rid of the filibuster. I've been very clear about that from the beginning. I would even accept a compromise of just reinstating the talking filibuster. The filibuster is not some sacrosanct constitutional principle. This was an obscure parliamentary maneuver from the 19th century that wasn't much used until it was weaponized in the fight against civil rights, first in the Jim Crow era, and then again in the 20th century during the civil rights movement, and then of course during the Obama presidency. And so it has become a tool that many in the Senate view as some kind of foundational element of their chamber, when in fact it's just kind of a perverted procedure now. And it's starting to undermine process fairness. Process fairness is this idea that regardless of the outcome, if you believe that the way things were decided is fair, you're more likely to assent to that outcome. And in a 330 million person democracy where you get your way, at best half the time, process fairness is critical for us to be able to sustain representative government. You've got to believe that, hey, I didn't like the outcome, but my voice was heard and the people representing me operated in a rules-based way. The filibuster is, I think, undermining process fairness now, because 14% of Americans can veto through 40 senators legislation that 86% of Americans support. That's not sustainable. The Senate was meant to be the cream in the coffee where it slows things down and cools things down and protects minority viewpoints. Fine. I think that's appropriate. That's a good use of the upper chamber. But 14% of Americans having a veto is not cooling things down and slowing things down. That's just obstructionist. That just becomes a veto on the will of the majority, and really a permanent veto on the will of the majority. So we've got to restore, at the very least, the talking filibuster, which requires that if you're going to have an unpopular view that slows things down, you at least have to have a crew of senators around you who are willing to rotate on the floor, talk with you to obstruct for days at a time. You've got to put some physical and social energy behind this, as opposed to now where, Rand Paul can just raise his hand and say, no, I don't want to do it. I mean, there's nothing sort of cerebral or important about that. That's just laziness. And then I know I'll get a question or a comment, and it's a fair one, that says, well, how are you going to feel, though, if Republicans take the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they start passing legislation with 51 senators? I'm going to feel mad. But again, if there's process fairness, I will accept those outcomes because it is representative of the country at large. And my job then is to go campaign and try to win back the chamber and convince Americans that I'm right, not to use some parliamentary tool to obstruct their will.
And do you feel the same way about judicial appointments, where you only need 51 votes to confirm a Supreme Court justice? Do you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, well, as you know, I think what you're implying is for nominations, they got rid of the filibuster. Yeah. And so now you can appoint with 51. And I think that's the right call. It used to be that the Senate would approve judges by sometimes unanimously, sometimes by 90 votes or more. Those days are gone now. It's become very politicized, very polarized. 51's a majority. That's how we govern, is you need a majority rule. And we can't have vacancies on the federal bench because people are playing chicken with each other.
We have another audience question relating to majority rule. Do you think that the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact will be passed, and if so, when?
I don't know, but it's a good idea. I don't know though.
Do you think it has? Do you think it has a shot of being passed?
I'm not well read enough on it to know that. I don't know whether it would be challenged in the Supreme Court, although I don't know what standing people would have to challenge it, because the states control how they cast their electors. And if the states decide they want to cast them on the national popular vote, then that seems to be their prerogative. So I don't, and I also don't know what the state of play is with the individual states ratifying it and approving it. So I'm not well versed enough to offer a thought. I'll just say that it seems to me a both clever and legitimate workaround to a really intractable problem.
I guess like adding on to like voting and like voting rights, what do you think that Congress can do in order to protect voting rights in the states that we're seeing them being taken away?
Well, we tried in the House and we passed some good laws about this, and they tried in the Senate, the Freedom to Vote Act, and both times it failed the filibuster. So the short and blunt answer is Congress is not going to pass anything about voting rights before the midterms, because we just don't have the votes to overcome the filibuster for it. We can and should pass the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is not quite about voting rights, but it is adjacent to that issue, which is to say respecting the will of the voters, in that this is the reform that would prevent states from ascribing an alternative set of electors, as they tried to do in Arizona and Michigan and elsewhere, that would override the will of the people. So that's a very important mechanism that Congress can pass, and I hope will pass in 2022. The fight for voting rights is state by state. And this goes back to what I said at the top of the hour. Local and state elections are so important. Most domestic policy in this country, most legislation that affects civil rights, most legislation that really determines how money is spent outside of healthcare and the military is done at the state level. And state and local politics is also more functional and has higher degrees of trust from the citizenry. It's really the best place to start. And yet Democrats, for at least the last 15 years, have underinvested in state and local organizing. I was talking to my predecessor, actually, who has started a terrific organization called Groundwork that's investing in local organizing and state organizing throughout the country. And Joe pointed out, he said, if people were willing to make the investment in Mississippi, you could turn that state purple in 5 to 10 years. Same people living in the state, same politics, frankly, just organizing, just the organizing of it, the spade work. It's not glamorous, door to door, business to business. And yet Democrats just really have underinvested in that for too long. We get very fixated on the Senate and the presidency, and we ignore everything down ballot. We got to stop doing that.
And how do you stay enthusiastic or prevent yourself from getting discouraged when the Senate has so much control over what actually becomes law?
Yeah, it's a good question. I try to be very disciplined and figure out the issues where I can meaningfully move the needle in legislation that's moving, or in changing the administration's approach to something. So COVID vaccines, I won't go into that again. I talked about that already, but we had real impact on the administration's approach to overseas vaccinations through kind of good old fashioned lobbying of the White House and a good combination of public and private pressure and meetings and resolutions. So there's that element of it, which I think is important. And then there's finding those pieces of legislation that have got to move. So the Coast Guard reauthorization, or the National Defense Authorization, or the Competes Act, which is the supply chain investment. You find those pieces of legislation that you think really are going to pass the Senate because they're kind of must pass, and then add on amendments that can deliver wins for the district. So I've done that, or I'm trying to do that with the Coast Guard reauthorization, trying to fix that bill to deliver a win for the offshore wind industry in Massachusetts. So don't agonize, organize, and we try to organize around legislation that is moving.
So I have a question. revolving the recent shooting that we saw in Buffalo, New York. So, what do you think are the implications regarding the rise of this belief of like this great replacement theory, and how do you think that is causing a problem in this country?
Yeah, what we saw in Buffalo is domestic terrorism. It's this toxic fusion of online conspiracizing with gun violence, with racism. And we've seen this kind of increase in hate crimes with racist violence, with anti-Semitic violence, with anti-Asian violence. And there's no one answer to it. I think there's a few things, though, that we need to ask ourselves as a country. One is, of course, our gun safety regulation. No civilian needs access to an automatic or, frankly, a semi-automatic weapon without any kind of background check. That's ridiculous. We're the only developed economy that has that process in place. I was in the Marine Corps. I have used every weapon that you can imagine. And the Marine Corps stores those weapons behind 3 locked doors every night. And in order to even put ammunition inside one of them, you've got to do 3 to 6 months of intensive training, because these things are death machines and they deserve that kind of protocol around them. So the idea that you can go to a big box store and get one over the counter is, I mean, it's just crazy. So we need state legislation in particular that can help fix that. And we need to hold gun manufacturers more liable for what their products do, particularly for allowing their products to be adapted in post-market sales or post-market servicing to make them automatic or to make them more lethal for human violence. We have got to really investigate and have a conversation as a country about social media, and to make it more nuanced than just talking about big tech. I find that term and that conversation pretty uninformative. What is big tech? Everything these days is big tech, right? I was just visiting a business in Newton that does robotics for surgery. Everything's got technology in it nowadays. Big tech, I think, is a term that doesn't capture the business models or the algorithms that we actually care about. Facebook and Amazon and Apple are very different companies. They each have revenues that are equal to the GDP of developed nations. They each deserve their own conversation about what we care about. But what is clear to me is that to a greater extent than at any time since the 16th century and the advent of the printing press, we have this new information technology that has just absolutely blown open the way that humans relate to one another, and the speed, diversity, and chaos with which information is transmitted. And we're going to have to update both our norms as well as our regulations and our institutions to deal with it while respecting the First Amendment, which is sacrosanct. And I will say, it's going to be your generation more even than mine, and certainly more than the baby boomers, who are going to help us figure out how to do this, because you all are digital natives. You understand the power, but also the great challenges with this technology. And I think you're going to be much more prepared to put thoughtful, actionable regulations in place than our current lawmakers.
Right. I have a question about if you have any opinions on Elon Musk's proposal to buy Twitter, and to what degree do you think social media like Twitter plays an influence on people's politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, Twitter is not real life. Any metric you want to use, Twitter is not a representative sample of American voters, Americans, period. But real people do use Twitter. And to a certain extent, Twitter has become the editorial page of American politics. It's where influencers both opine and digest information about the state of play and current events in a way that's a very high leverage conversation. People using Twitter are oftentimes at the levers of power or influence in other spheres of life. And so while Twitter is not real life, it does have real impact. I do think we've got to be very careful about how we censor speech on Twitter. I think that is a problem, that is something to be protective of as a nation that prizes the First Amendment and that has a strong and long precedent of protecting political speech above all else. I mean, our rules around political speech protection are as darn near ironclad as you can get. We really protect even the most noxious forms of political speech. So we've got to be careful about that. And yet, like I said before, in one generation, we've gone from a time when communication was one to many and was filtered through a lot of different levels of curation and judgment, to a time when communication now is one to one, one to many to many, across 7 billion people, or the 3 billion people who have smartphones. It's just an explosion of new opportunities, but also new problems. And we really do need to update our regulations to adapt to it.
One more. So I had a question about your time at Newton North. Was there any teacher at North that left an important impact on you?
Many. The pedagogy at Newton North, at Day, at Pierce was superb. I feel very lucky, really lucky, to have grown up in Newton and gone to those schools. Mr. Staller, history teacher in 9th grade. Mrs. Green, my math teacher in 10th and 12th grade. Mr. Belmarsh, chemistry teacher. So many. Miss Picard, who I think is your vice principal now. Miss Winston, you know her as Miss Winston. I knew her as Miss Picard. Miss Winston, who was your vice principal and was my physics teacher in 9th grade, and was a dynamite physics teacher, and put up with me being a knucklehead a bunch of the time as a 9th grade boy. And teachers like that, administrators like Mr. Aronson, really had just been a great part of growing up in Newton, and I hope my kids have similar experiences with their teachers.
I think we have time for one last question. If you could go back in time and be part of a debate over a certain bill or a piece of legislation in Congress, what would it be?
That's an awesome question. Wow, I am totally unprepared for that question. Probably the Iraq War. I think there's obviously tons of legislation and historical moments for the last 250 years that would have been a thrill to be a part of, from the first Congress onwards. I mean, being in the Civil War era Congresses, or the Congresses that passed the 13th, 14th, 15 amendments, all that would be unbelievable, obviously, in the New Deal legislation. But the Iraq War was a huge mistake, and Congress really granted the presidency way too much authority and prerogative for how it not just waged war overseas, but how it surveilled its own population in the name of domestic security. And I wish we had not made that mistake, because I think it damaged our politics in ways that are hard to appreciate now, but have really percolated for the last 2 decades.
I think we don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know you have things to get to, but I think that's a good place to stop. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in.
Yeah, it's a terrific conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay.
Yeah.